I was 77 the night the blue light bloomed on my phone and turned the kitchen into a small square aquarium. I had just smoothed the navy dress that James always said made me look like a midnight flower, modest, steady, and a little stubborn. At the sink, steam curled from the kettle, and the clock's patient hand clicked toward 7. Garrett and Marissa had said dinner would be at 7. A seat at the table, that was all. Then my son's message slid across the screen like a blade wrapped in politeness. You weren't invited. My wife doesn't want you there. I don't know how long I sat there. The kettle boiled itself hoarse, and outside the magnolia tree kept waving its heavy leaves as if nothing in the world had shifted. It is a strange thing to feel your heart break without the dramatics of sound or tears. Mine did the quiet kind of breaking, the kind that makes the room unfamiliar, your own body suddenly a rented space. I thought of the homework nights and scraped knees and birthday mornings when Garrett used to lean into me with bed-warm hair and frosting on his cheeks, and I wondered where that boy had gone. For a moment I told myself it was a mistake, that technology had been mischievous and cruel. Then I read it again. It wasn't a mistake. It was a door closing with the softest click, the kind that is easy to miss until you feel the draft. I took the dress off with the tenderness of someone removing a bandage from skin that hasn't yet decided whether it will scar. I hung it back on its wire shoulder in the closet and stood there for a while, listening to the metal tremble faintly. I could have called. I could have texted something gracious. No worries, darling. Another time. I could have apologized for a crime I hadn't committed, the way women of my mother's generation were trained to sand down their edges until there was nothing left but a kind smile and a habit of disappearing. Instead, I made tea. I didn't drink and went to the old secretary desk, where I keep everything that matters and too much that doesn't. The drawer slid open with a sigh that felt like my own. The folders were labeled in my thin, stubborn script: insurance, utilities, James's letters, and the one that had always made me both proud and tired: Garrett. It was thick as winter. Inside were handholds from a lifetime bank transfers that got him through college when he was more dream than discipline, the check that launched a business which folded like a paper boat in a storm, the tuition I paid when Marissa went back to school and learned to sell houses she would never invite me into, the not quite a gift, not quite a loan, that put a roof over their heads and a kitchen island under her perfectly manicured elbows. Every page was its own small confession. I didn't know how to love without proving it in numbers. I laid the papers on the table and pretended I was studying a stranger's life. It can be easier to be honest with other people's stories. The truth sat there blinking at me from the printed lines. I had become their safety net, which is a noble way to describe a woman everyone assumes will catch them when they jump. Love had become a ledger. My affection an open faucet, my gratitude a zero-interest loan. Somewhere in the long corridor between Garrett learning his alphabet and Garrett texting me that his wife didn't want me at the table, I had stopped being someone's mother and become something else, an account that remembers your number. I spent that night in a chair by the window watching the neighborhood make its rituals of quiet. Porch lights clicked off like stars with bedtime. Someone across the street took their dog out in slippers and a robe that caught the lamplight like silk. The magnolia's shadow leaned across my lawn and back again. I kept hearing James, whose voice still lives behind my left ear, as it always did when I needed courage. He was not a man of pretty speeches, but he knew the sentence that mattered: Edith, love them, but don't let them walk on you. Back then, I'd laughed because our boy had been 9 and beautiful, and who could imagine the softest feet walking on a mother? I don't laugh about it anymore. There are tread marks you can't see, but you feel them when you stand up. At sunrise, I made the kind of tea that scolds you for not drinking it while it's hot. The light came in thin and new and a little embarrassed for the way the world had behaved in the dark. I put on my glasses and dialed the bank. When the woman answered, I spoke my name in a voice that surprised me with how steady it sounded. I asked her to suspend the automatic payments, the 87 I could name from memory, and the ones that had multiplied during the years when I stopped counting, because counting is a kind of admitting. I asked her to revoke the power of attorney I had handed to Garrett, on a day when I was so proud of the handsome man my baby had become that I would have signed anything that proved I trusted him. The woman on the line was kind in that crisp, procedural way kindness sometimes wears in offices. She told me what would happen next, what I had to bring in, what she could stop that day. All of them, I said, and I felt something loosen in my chest like a knot finally unlearning itself. When I hung up, the house sounded larger. Have you ever noticed how noise obeys the size of your sorrow? The nights I felt smallest, every appliance whirred louder, the refrigerator clicked like an impatient finger, the floorboards announced each step as if the house needed the world to know I was still there. That morning the rooms gentled, the air did not press. The clock remembered how to whisper. I looked at the folder again. I did not feel angry. People imagine these moments as red storms and breakage, but for me it was the calmness of setting down a tray you never agreed to carry. Around 9, my phone shivered with a call I didn't answer, and then with the kind of message where apologies wear sensible shoes. Mom, that text was harsh. Marissa was just stressed. We can do Sunday instead. Every word felt like a cloth draped over a broken chair. Pretty enough from across the room, useless if you sit on it. I typed out a single sentence that took me 3 tries to complete because my thumbs kept shaking. It's time you learned to pay your own way. I deleted it. I typed it again, thinking of the times I had said, of course, when I'd wanted to say no, and of the costliest sentence in any woman's vocabulary. It's fine, it's not fine. I sent the message. Then I turned the phone face down on the table and waited for the panic I was sure would come. It didn't. What came felt like oxygen. I washed the good coffee cups and set them to dry on a towel with sprigs of lemons printed across it, a gift from Rebecca last Christmas. She had chosen it because it looked like summer. She is Garrett's daughter, but not Marissa's, the child of his first marriage, and maybe that is why she carries so little of her stepmother's polish. There is in Rebecca a quiet that reminds me of my mother, a way of seeing that doesn't blink at the unflattering things. She calls on Sundays with news about her classes and the stray cat she failed to resist, and every call ends with, I love you. Grandma spoken as if love is a coat she wants to be sure I keep buttoned. I think of her when I am tempted to soften what should stay firm. There must be one person in a family who refuses to lie. By noon, the doorbell drilled the air in that insistent way Garrett learned from his father's impatience with bells that didn't hurry. I opened the door and there he stood, the boy I had taught to tie his laces, now tied up in a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, his hair expensive and resentful of the wind. Mom, he said without a greeting that meant anything. What did you do? Behind him, the magnolia nodded like a gossip who had been waiting for this. He walked in without waiting for my yes, which is another kind of answer. The living room gathered its breath the way rooms do before an argument that thinks it's a conversation. I let him talk. There is a form of grace in letting someone use up all their rehearsed sentences. He had them stacked and ready: the mortgage, the car payment, the tuition that had the word urgent stamped on it since the day tuition was invented. He said we as if it were a shield in family, as if it were an invoice. He kept glancing at the kitchen where for years a cake or a casserole shaped like a cake would appear when he arrived. Because in my house, food has always been the apology we made on behalf of life for being so unspectacularly hard. There was no cake on the counter. There was a bowl of lemons and a vase full of the backyard's few brave roses. I poured tea he didn't drink and watched him retell the story of how the world owed him because I had trained it to. When he ran out of breath, I asked him the question that had been standing inside me all morning, like someone waiting to be called to the witness stand. Tell me one thing you've done for me, Garrett, that wasn't attached to a request. Not because I was your mother and you were supposed to, but because you wanted to. One thing in the last year. I asked it softly because anger makes people deaf. He looked at his hands the way boys do when they're searching for a story that will make them look better. He looked at the lemons as if they might whisper him an answer. He looked at me like a man who has reached a bend in the road and discovered that he never learned how to take a curve without someone else's hand on the wheel. He did not answer because there was nothing to say that was true. It would be satisfying to tell you I felt triumphant, that the moment gleamed like a sword pulled from a stone, my name ringing from everyone's mouth in the square. But the truth is quieter and less cinematic. I felt tired. Not defeated, not righteous, just done. I thought of James again, how he always returned the cart at the grocery store, even in the rain. Because we're not animals, he'd say, and it made me laugh the way common sense sometimes does. That's what boundaries are, the returning of the cart after years of leaving it wherever is easiest and calling it kindness. After Garrett left with his mouth full of promises he hadn't chewed, the house breathed out. I fed the roses, watered the magnolia, and sat in the chair by the window where the afternoon light breaks into small coins and spends itself across the rug. There was grief in me, the old grief of a woman learning that she cannot mother her way into being cherished, and the newer grief of a mother telling a grown child that love is not a bottomless bowl. But there was also something else, something that felt like the smallest room at the back of my heart, finally opening a window and letting its air move. It smelled like lemons. It sounded like the clink of cups on a towel drying by themselves. It looked like a table set for one without apology. When evening came, like a thoughtful guest, I did the radical thing of making dinner just for me. A piece of salmon with its skin properly crisped green beans. I snapped with my fingers a small glass of white wine. I sipped as if it were permission. I set the table for one, and did not put a second plate out of habit. I ate slowly, and tasted everything because I wasn't competing with anyone's hurry. After I washed the single fork, the knife, the plate with its constellation of crumbs, and I thought about the years when I had scrubbed dishes for people who left without saying thank you or good night. I dried my hands and looked at the phone, silent for a mercy of minutes, and understood that if I wanted a different ending, I would have to choose a different middle. That night before bed, I wrote a note to myself in the notebook I keep on the nightstand, the one where I collect the sentences I want to stand on when the old training tries to haul me back into its harness. I wrote, "You are not cruel for refusing to be used. You are not unloving because your love now arrives with a spine. You are not abandoned. You are deciding." And then I added in smaller letters, which is the size truth sometimes needs while it gathers its courage. It's okay to be the woman who locks her own door and sleeps. The next morning woke like a polite stranger, hesitant to touch anything. I moved through the rooms with a softness that surprised me, as if the furniture were bruised by all the words that had been spoken in it. It is a strange thing to be 77 and relearning how to live alone without rehearsing the speech you'll give someone else about it. I made the bed with corners as sharp as sailors' pleats smoothed the duvet and noticed how the fabric remembered the shape of two people, even though I've been one for years. Grief has a long reach. It can still tug the fabric where a body used to be. I watered the philodendron in the corner until its leaves gleamed like promises kept. Then I opened the secretary desk again, not for the Garrett folder this time, but for the one labeled James's Letters. It is dangerous work visiting the voice of the dead before breakfast. He was a spare man in life, but on paper he was abundant. He would fold each page into a neat rectangle and write my name on the outside, as if my name itself were a house the letter wanted to live inside. The first I picked up was dated the summer Garrett lost his first tooth, and we celebrated with pancakes and $1 under his pillow in the same breath. In it, James had written what he always wrote when he was trying to stitch something practical to something tender: "Edith, take care of the future," as if it were a guest who might arrive early. I read that line twice, and then pulled out the envelope I had never opened because it made my hands too warm with dread. On its flap he'd written, "In case I'm clumsy enough to go first." He was. Inside I found not a confession as my fearful heart had predicted, but a list. James loved lists: groceries, tools, the steps to assembling a shelf, the places he wanted to plant bulbs so spring would surprise us by pretending to remember what it owed. This list was different. Accounts Rebecca should know exist when she is older. At the bottom a sentence: "She will be the one who sees you clearly." It wasn't lawyerly. It wasn't even correct, really, legally. Everything had been tidy when he died. But there was tucked into the envelope a photocopy of a deed transfer form with his cramped signature and a note, asked Martin to help file this if I forget. He knows. The deed wasn't for this house which we had finished paying for in a long life of small checks and slow pride. It was for the lake cabin 2 hours north, the one with the porch that held up Augusts like a second sky. The form named me as sole owner until such time Edith wishes to convey to Rebecca. It wasn't filed. It had never been filed. My name was on our original title, but the cabin, oh, the cabin had been folded into the mess of family assumptions and informal promises after James died, and by the time I remembered to worry, Garrett had assured me it was handled. There are words that should come with warning labels. Handled is one. I put the papers aside and called Martin, the lawyer who had been James's fishing companion and our will whisperer. He answered with a solemn hello that always reminded me of church, then brightened when I said my name. When I told him what I had found, he exhaled a kind of weary relief. I thought it might be there. He told me he was having second thoughts about all that generosity. We made a plan. Then he got sick. I could hear him opening drawers. Edith, come in today if you can. Bring what you have. We'll look. When he said we, the word felt like a bench I was allowed to sit on. I dressed in that navy dress not because I needed to look like a midnight flower for anyone else, but because it made me recognize myself in the mirror as someone who had not vanished into the wallpaper. On the way, I stopped at a bakery where the croissants are so flaky they should come with a warning for the floor, and bought a paper bag full like an offering to courage. The receptionist at Martin's office had hair the color of ripe wheat and a smile that made my ribs loosen. She called me Ms. Pierce, and for a moment, the formal name felt like a crown I'd forgotten I owned. In his office, we put the papers side by side. Martin is a man who treats paper with the tenderness some people reserve for cats. He smoothed each page with the flat of his hand and made little pleased sounds when things matched. He found in his files the draft James had asked him to draw up and the note in James's handwriting that said in so many words, "If Edith ever needs to pull the reins, make sure she has the reins." We talked about the house and the cabin and the accounts. We talked about power of attorney, which I had mistakenly not revoked everywhere, because grief had made me polite to a fault. We talked about Rebecca. "She's the one with the spine," I said, and Martin smiled like a man who has watched families long enough to know that spines skip a generation. It was not revenge to tidy the papers. Justice is quieter than revenge, but it is a cousin. We did not undo what had been done out of kindness when kindness was all we had to fill the dark. We relabeled, re-signed, refiled. I felt the surreal momentum of someone putting their name back on their own life. When we finished, I left with a folder that was thinner and stronger than the one I'd arrived with. "Consider a trust," he said gently at the door. "Not to punish Edith. To keep your wishes from being manhandled when someone feels entitled." The word entitled landed in my chest like a tiny bell. I nodded. Outside, the afternoon had awakened, and everything was brighter than it had any right to be. On my way home, I stopped at the cemetery. James didn't ask much from the living now, just the occasional weeds plucked from the base of his stone and the favor of my conversation. I told him what I had done. I told him it felt like returning the grocery cart. I told him I was scared of the storm that might rise when the people who believed I was a weather system under their control discovered I had learned to forecast for myself. A breeze lifted the hair at my temple, the way his hand used to when his fingers were playfully counting the years we had left. "How many summers do we get?" he'd ask. "Enough," I'd answer, being brave. I stood there long enough to watch a pair of birds argue and make up on the branch above him. The world goes on. It's infuriating and blessed that it does. When I got home, there were 3 voicemails and 4 texts stacked on my phone like dishes left by someone who never asked if the sink was willing. Marissa's voice is champagne when she wants something and vinegar when she doesn't get it. "Edith," she said in the voicemail that kept trying to smile, "we were all very hurt by your dramatic decision. Family supports family. I told Garrett maybe it was time we take a step back, regroup. The word regroup belonged to business meetings. It sounded wrong in the mouth of a woman I had watched rearrange my granddaughter's birthday cupcakes because the frosting peaks offended her sense of symmetry. Also, the cabin were planning a little Memorial Day thing like always. You'll be there, right? I put the phone down and sat at the table and laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of amusement that arrives when the mask on someone's face announces itself as plastic, and you had been so convinced of skin. I did not answer her. Instead, I sent a message to Rebecca. I didn't plan it. My fingers did. Lemon bars. This Saturday. 3 dots appeared so fast my phone must have been poised to catch them. Yes, please, she wrote. Then a second message, shy as clean handwriting on a brand new notebook. Grandma, are you okay? I almost said. I was fine. Instead, learning. She sent back a heart and a photo of the cat asleep in a bowl of laundry, like a small god who had chosen cotton as his temple. I felt something in me steady. Saturday she came in like the house had been waiting for her. 17 looks so fragile on some girls, and like a sword on others. On Rebecca, it is a clear window. She puts her bag down and hugs me, as if she intends to make a home out of the space between us. We sifted confectioner's sugar into a blizzard, and pressed shortbread into the pan, and talked about her literature class, where the teacher kept insisting that subtext was just what people really mean when they are pretending to be polite. We both laughed because we speak that language fluently. She asked about Sunday dinners, and I told her I was planning to serve myself fiercely. She nodded like it was the right answer on a test for which she had been studying her whole life. In the middle of whisking eggs, she said very softly, "Dad is scared." I wiped a bit of flour from her cheek with my thumb the way I used to when she was little. "He should be," I said as gently as a truth can be said. Not of me, but of the work he's never done because I did it. She stared at the lemon zest like it had secrets, then said, "Marissa told him to tell you the text was a mistake. She said you're too sentimental to stay mad." She looked up quickly as if worried she'd hurt me with how accurately she remembered me. "I'm not staying mad," I said, and smiled. "I'm staying. Staying is its own act of rebellion when leaving has been your chore." After we put the pan in the oven, Rebecca wandered to the secretary desk as if it were a museum exhibit about a rare animal, a woman who keeps her papers in order. On the desk's open leaf, the folder from Martin's office lay like a fresh map. She didn't reach for it. She has learned to ask. "May I?" I nodded. She read the top sheet, and then the next, her brow furrowing and then smoothing. "Grandma," she whispered, "the cabin, does this mean—" I told her what it meant, and that it did not mean anyone was banished from breathing the same air as its pine porch, but that the days of Marissa staging photographs there for her listings and calling it our little woodland jewel were over. Rebecca laughed, a quick, bright sound that hit the ceiling and made the whole room better. "She's going to hate that," she said, then clapped her hand over her mouth as if she'd spilled something. "She'll survive," I said. I didn't add, "She has survived on my softness for years." When the bars cooled enough to slice, we ate them on the back steps. The magnolia had begun to wax itself into extravagant blooms, each one a theater of petals. We ate in silence for a while because good lemon bars are prayer and demand respect. Then Rebecca said, "I have to tell you something," and the way she said it rearranged the air. The cat in the laundry had prepared me for humor. This was not humor. "I found emails," she said faintly, on Dad's laptop when he asked me to print his presentation for a listing. "He's been moving things. Money. From the cabin rentals. And he's been paying for things with your card. He saved the numbers on file at 3 places." She swallowed. "He told the bank you said it was okay. I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry." There are moments when anger arrives dressed as clarity. I did not feel the hot theatrical rage that likes to bang doors and throw plates in movies. I felt a precise alignment of facts. The sound in my ears sharpened. I could hear the neighbors' wind chimes negotiate with the breeze, the far sound of a mower apologizing to the grass, my own breath behaving. I put my hand over Rebecca's. "You told me," I said. "That was the doing." She nodded and cried the way good girls cry when they accidentally break a rule that needed breaking. I thought of all the times I had made myself smaller to let someone else be the hero in a story I was financing. No more. I called Martin on Monday. There are processes for everything in this world, even for pulling back the goods someone believes your love gifted them forever. We filed the papers we should have filed years ago. We spoke to the bank in a language that closed doors men had built with bolts they assumed I could not reach. We sent certified letters that made the word certified feel like a gavel in your hand. Martin used phrases like unauthorized use and restitution and accountability, and each one felt like a tile falling into place in a mosaic that would, when it was finished, look like my own face. We did not make a show of it. We did not post anything. Revenge is showy. Justice is a craftsman in a workshop at dawn. Marissa called 3 times that afternoon. When I didn't answer, she sent a text that tried to alternate between tenderness and threat, like a porch light flickering between on and off. "You're being cruel," she wrote. And 2 messages later, "We can take you to court for emotional damages." I laughed alone in my kitchen, the sound surprising me with its brightness. Then came the photograph, the cabin porch, her feet on the railing, wine glass in hand, a caption, "Missing summer already." I stared at the image the way you look at a painting you once thought profound and now recognize as posture. I did not reply. The papers had already replied on my behalf. That night I slept the way people in magazines always sleep, white sheets, a calm mouth, the suggestion of a breeze moving a curtain. Around 3, I woke with the old Panic standing by the bed. It is a tall woman, Panic with long fingers, and a habit of reaching for the light switch. I told her as politely as possible to sit down. "We are not who we used to be," I said to the ceiling. "We have a lock on the door." In the morning, the light arrived with its usual awkward kindness, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't flinch at its enthusiasm. I know this is where some stories rush toward their fireworks. The confrontation, the knock on the door, the shouted truth overheard by neighbors who pretend not to listen. But life, especially at 77, is more patient with its climaxes. It asks for sustained courage. It requires a willingness to live inside a series of small decisions that add up to a different person. So I made my tea and ate my toast and called the porch repairman because the top step had started to wobble in a way that suggested injury. I tended to what I could fix with a hammer and a checkbook with my own name on it. I wrote to Rebecca to ask how she did on her exam. I pulled the weeds that had the audacity to pretend they belonged beside my roses. And I waited for the next reasonable thing to do, which is sometimes the most radical thing a woman can teach herself after years of emergency. The days that followed were the kind of quiet that remembers its own noise, like the hush after a choir stops and the notes go on living in the rafters. When people talk about breaking patterns, they make it sound like a dramatic declaration, but my revolutions looked like errands. I woke and wrote the check to the porch repairman. I walked through the house and gathered every spare key with my handwriting on the tag. I made a list of subscriptions that belonged to versions of me who kept saying yes long after her mouth had learned no. I went to the hardware store where the man behind the counter knows me as Ma'am with the rose bushes, and I bought a new deadbolt one so clean it looked like a blank page. I brought it home and called a locksmith because there are some things you should let a professional do so you can watch and notice how the lock, when turned, says a small satisfying click, like a new habit accepting you. Sometime near dusk, I stood at the sink with my hands in dishwater and thought of the lake. It arrived the way some places do not, as a picture or a map, but as a smell pine and damp wood and the metallic sweetness of morning air that hasn't forgiven your breath yet. I saw the porch with its boards like lines on a well-read palm. I heard the rope swing argue with the wind. We hadn't been since James's last summer. And even then, he had leaned into the porch rail like a man who knows it will have to remember him for both of us. The cabin had haunted my thoughts for days, not because of the paperwork, but because it was the place where we used to practice being happy. I dried my hands and went to the closet where the old canvas duffel waited like a memory I was ready to carry forward again. I called Martin in the morning. "I'm driving up," I told him, "today." He did not talk me out of courage. He only said, "I'll alert the sheriff's office there that you'll be changing the locks. Bring the papers naming you as owner. If anyone shows up uninvited, call them not Garrett." His voice had that way of settling a room, even down a phone line. Before I left, I texted Rebecca going to the lake to check the cabin. "We'll send a picture of the ugly birdhouse if it's still ugly." She replied with a string of hearts and a single "proud of you," which may be the most powerful sentence a granddaughter can send to a grandmother who is learning to be someone new, in a body that has known every kind of old. The drive is 2 hours of trees that don't care what you've suffered, and sky that refuses to apologize for its moods. I pass the diner with the lavender pie that tastes like a dare, and the stretch of road where the asphalt remembers every winter like a grudge. When the lake finally lifted itself up through the pines and laid its silver body out beside me, my throat did that small animal ache that love causes when you didn't realize you needed it. I turned down the gravel drive that still doesn't know how to be a road, and parked where James used to park at that angle he claimed was necessary for a quick exit, even though we never left quickly. The porch had aged, but not in any way that would embarrass it. The birdhouse was still hideous blue, as a bruise lopsided like a drunk sailor's hat, the gift of a neighbor we didn't know how to refuse. "Do we keep it?" I asked the empty yard. "We keep it," the place said back. The key slid into the old lock and twisted with a tight, familiar relief. The cabin smelled like wood and last summer and a handful of acorns the squirrels had smuggled in through a bravado hole in the screen. Dust made slow galaxies in the light. The dishes in the sink were mine, washed and dried and stacked at a slant years ago by a woman trying to memorize an ordinary moment. I walked room to room with my fingers trailing the air like a blind person learning a face. On the mantel, the photo of James in a red flannel shirt looked less like a picture and more like a window into the one August where everything had been good by accident. I touched the frame and said hello out loud because the living and the dead are just neighbors with different house rules. Changing the locks felt like an act of respect, not defiance. The locksmith arrived with his box of metal angels and asked no questions beyond the ones that mattered. "You want the deadbolt keyed different from the handle?" "Yes," I said. "This time I do." I signed the paperwork, and he tipped his cap the way men in old movies do when a woman has done something worth noting that nobody will ever write about. When he left, I brewed coffee in the old tin press that dents if you look at it with strong opinions and sat on the porch. The lake glittered with the self-importance of bodies that know they feed the sky. A pair of loons paddled past like gossipers who had given up on lowering their voices. I felt my shoulders drop into their proper home. It is miraculous how many wrong places a body can live before it finds a chair that fits. There is a compartment beneath the third porch board from the left, where James once hid a ring for me on our 30th anniversary because he believed secrets should have the dignity of wood. I pried up the board with the old pry bar hanging on the wall like a relic. Underneath a tin box, waited with the patience of things that aren't afraid of time. Inside, there were the kinds of treasures people hoard when they can't keep people a dried four-leaf clover, an old matchbook from a motel we stayed in, because the car decided to have opinions, and a bundle of letters tied with string that had yellowed the same way snapshots do confidently. My hand shook. The first was my handwriting on the outside. "For later, when you need courage, that isn't yours." I laughed because I had never been that sly, and then I remembered sometimes we are better to ourselves than we recall. Beneath my notes to myself were pages in James's all-capitals print that bellowed even when he meant to whisper. He had written months before his illness became a fact the kinds of lines that men who love in practicalities write. "If it's complicated with the kids, remember, we had a plan. The cabin is yours until you choose otherwise. let it be a refuge, not a battleground. If someone insists on a battle call, Martin and the sheriff, not your son, your safety first. I love you, E. There were other pages, the start of a letter to Rebecca. He never finished a map with X's, where the gas shut off and the water line lived. A list titled, Reasons We Once Wanted to Sell. Ignore this when we're sad. I sat with those papers and felt a kind of benevolent fury. He had tried to spare me this. He had known what generosity becomes when it isn't tended. He had tried to make a path through the bramble of what would come. We had simply run out of summer. The first text arrived while I was still reading that same chilled politeness that always sounded like Marissa speaking into Garrett's fingers. We heard you went up to the cabin. We'll be there this weekend. Tradition. I could see her mouth shaping the word like a brand. I typed, The locks are changed. You are welcome at my invitation. I deleted it. I typed, We need to speak with a sheriff present. I deleted that too. Then I called the sheriff's office and spoke to a woman whose voice had the iron kindness of someone who has escorted too many people through scenes they should never have to rehearse. We made a plan. It felt like setting a table, the right number of chairs, the proper plates, the good knives not for show but because eating well is defense against panic. I slept in the cabin that night, the way you sleep in a house you used to know, with one ear out the window, listening for ghosts and raccoons, and the ideas that arrive at 2 a.m. dressed as disasters. The loons called in the dark like mourners, and I answered them in my head with every small apology I owed myself. For years I had not kept promises to the girl I once was. I woke before the lake had fully remembered its shine and made oatmeal the way my mother taught me, salt not sugar, because sweetness is not always what a morning needs. By 10, the sheriff's truck rolled up with its quiet authority. Deputy Lane is a woman about Rebecca's age, with eyes that have already learned more than mine did at 30. You, Edith, she asked, and when I said yes, she nodded like we were joining a club neither of us had wanted to form. Garrett's car arrived 20 minutes later, and he stepped out with the aura of a man who expects a room to apologize for not having risen when he entered. Marissa wore sandals that didn't understand dirt. They stopped when they saw Deputy Lane. There is a particular stillness that lives in the space between entitlement and consequence. It's like the silence before a storm chooses a direction. Mom, Garrett said, and in his mouth, the word sounded less like a name and more like a password he expected to unlock a familiar door. He glanced at the new locks like they were an insult. You changed the locks. Beside him, Marissa's expression made it clear she had poured the gasoline and was now seeking the match. Deputy Lane spoke in a voice that would make a dog sit. This is Ms. Pierce's property. She has the right to decide who enters and when. Today she has invited you to talk on the porch. You will not enter the house without her consent. The rules hung in the air like clean laundry. Marissa adjusted her sunglasses and smiled that tight smile she wears when she believes charm will dismantle boundaries. We're family, she said, as if the word were a skeleton key. We always spend Memorial Day here. I looked at the birdhouse, ugly and somehow holy, and answered, Tradition is just a habit with better stories. We sat, me and my son and his wife and the deputy, who made the porch a civilized country. I had the papers in a folder on my lap, the way a person clutches a passport in a strange city. Garrett started with the song I knew by heart. Stress misunderstandings, that text blown out of proportion. The economy. The algorithm. The cruel neighbors who had opinions about his success and failure as if opinions could qualify as rent. He said Mom, the way a person says mercy. He reached for my hand, the way a child does in a crowd who has learned that hands are given, not earned. I put my palm flat on the folder, like a priest blessing bread. You used my card without asking. I said not a question, but a stone placed in the center of the path. He flinched, a small motion of the mouth that told me truth had raked him across the gums. Marissa leaned forward in her chair and delivered her favorite sentence, You're being dramatic. I looked at the lake, which has never once apologized for its theatrics. No, I said, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. I am being exact. I handed Deputy Lane the list from the bank, the charges, the dates, the places where my name had been used, like a keyring shoved against every lock. We'll sort that at the station, Deputy Lane said gently to Garrett, and the phrase at the station folded itself into the day, like a shadow at noon. Marissa's sunglasses slid down her nose, her eyes flicking from my face to the papers to the lock on the door, as if the world had changed languages and she had not been given the translation. I did not shout. I did not cry. I told the story as if I were reading it to a child who needed the safety of sequence. I told them about the messages the bank the power of attorney revoked in all the places I should have revoked it before the deed the cabin. I read the line from James's letter because love is sometimes the best witness. If someone insists on a battle call, Martin and the sheriff, not your son. Garrett's shoulders softened and then hardened again, like he was arguing with a wind you cannot see. Dad would never. He began, then stopped, because the paper had my husband's unstealable handwriting. He tried to make it easy, I said. We made it hard. Sometimes the truth does not shatter a family. It resets it. But in the few seconds after you say it out loud, you can hear the glass consider itself. Garrett stood and paced that teenage pacing he used to do when he wanted a consequence to go away by wearing out the carpet around it. We can fix this, he said, which is the anthem of men who want the women to come in with mops after they have knocked over the paint. You can start by returning what isn't yours, I said, and the sentence felt like it had been practicing its whole life to be chosen. A gust came across the lake and lifted the birdhouse on its nail so that it swung and creaked like an old hinge. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker auditioned for thunder. The day had the taste of a storm that might not bother to rain. Deputy Lane's radio murmured something calm. Marissa, seeing the performance she had prepared for Unravel, went to the place where cruelty and charm touch hands. If you do this, she said, voice thin as a high wire, you won't see your son again. Or your granddaughter. There it was, the bargain women are offered, in exchange for their silence, love as ransom. Marissa, I said, and I let my mouth soften, because I once believed she would be my daughter. You have underestimated a 77-year-old woman's capacity for solitude. I know how to eat alone. I know how to breathe without permission. And I know a threat when I hear it. I turned to Garrett. You brought her into our home. It is your work to tell her how we treat each other there. He looked at the lake, and then at the deputy, and then at me. And for a flicker of a moment, I saw the boy who used to search my face for answers before he had decided to love easier ones. We did not finish anything that day. Life rarely allows glory at noon. But we arranged the pieces into honest piles, what would be returned, what would be paid back, who would speak to whom with what witness present, who would stay away until they remembered how to knock. As they left, the gravel spat under the tires like a cat that had had enough. Deputy Lane tipped the brim of her hat at me and said, You did good. I wanted to correct her grammar and tell her I had done well, but good is what she meant, and good is what I had done for myself. As the evening pulled honey out of the pines and the lake dimmed to pewter, I sat with James's letters in my lap and chose a page to fold into my wallet, a talisman, a spine. On the porch, the birdhouse continued its ugly faithfulness. Tradition is the habits you keep after you know better. I poured myself tea and rehearsed what might come, the paperwork, the meetings, the anger that will try to borrow my mouth. And beneath all that noise, a quieter sound steadied me, the future knocking like a polite guest who has arrived right on time. Memorial Day approached like a drumbeat moving in from the horizon, slow at first, then unmistakable. In the days before, the admin of it all kept me steady. I sat at the dining table with a stack of manila folders that looked like a small city and made order out of years that had been too generous to call themselves generous. Martin and I built a restitution plan that didn't sound like revenge when read aloud dates, amounts in agreement that anything borrowed without my permission would be returned in monthly payments that matched the math of their lives rather than mine. We added a clause barring use of my name, my cards, my credit, my house, my cabin, without my signature, and the eyes of a notary watching the pen. It felt like laying down a path stone by stone across a river that had been happy to drown me. Rebecca came over after school, carrying a scanner she'd borrowed from the library. So heavy her arms trembled and so silly in its box that we laughed until the house forgot to be solemn. We worked like colleagues, she fed pages, and I named files with a precision that would have satisfied James if he hadn't already learned how to be content with my chaos. We shared the kind of silence that isn't empty at all, a silence full of purpose and the sweet little noises of a home doing its work. The click of a stapler, the hum of a fan, the cat making a decision, and then falling asleep in it. Once Rebecca said, "I like your face when you're determined," and I had to put my pen down, because I had never thought about my face that way before, how it must look when I am walking toward myself instead of away. On Thursday, the phone rang with the tone I now associate with facts. Martin didn't bother with preamble. Two things he said, shuffling papers across a distance I could hear. Bank investigator confirmed several card not present transactions tied to an IP address registered at your son's home. Calls to authorize increases came from a voice that did not pass voice verification, but a human override allowed it. We have recordings. He paused, letting the words find their shape in my chest. And he added softer, there was a pending attempt to secure a line of credit against your house using a power of attorney that you've now revoked. Application paused after the bank requested an in-person signature. The paperwork bears a similarity to your signature that they'd like you to confirm is not yours. I sat very straight and breathed like someone learning to stand on a moving train. Is it criminal? I asked. It can be. It doesn't have to be, he said. You get to decide how far the truth travels. That night I took all the keys I had gathered, their little metal faces like a chorus, and laid them on a towel. I kept two on a ring that felt exactly right in my palm, like a small animal that had decided I could be trusted. The rest went in a box with a label printed in block letters, "Not in use." I slept not perfectly but honestly, and woke with the lake in my bones again. The body remembers its places. Saturday, I drove up with a tote bag full of groceries that made the car smell like dill and stone fruit. The cabin greeted me with its familiar hello, the screen door's complaint, the porch's long sigh, the way the sun writes your name across the floorboards if you arrive at the right hour. I swept the place like an old woman, apprenticed to a ritual she believes in. The ugly blue birdhouse nodded at me like a fool who is loyal in all the ways that matter. I brewed coffee, the kind that bites before it comforts, and took the folder of papers to the porch like a person bringing a cake to a table that will not argue about whether it is deserved. By noon, a sky that had been promising its good behavior allowed a little drama at the edges. The wind came in with ideas. Across the water, I could see a pontoon boat decorated with flags, as if joy could be borrowed on credit. The sheriff's truck rolled up just after 1. Deputy Lane stepped out with the calm of someone whose job is to offer grammar to other people's chaos. "We'll keep it simple," she said, and her eyes did that quiet inventory of the scene people do when they are planning mercy and boundaries at the same time. Rebecca and I set out lemonade and a plate of sandwiches wrapped like presents. "Grandma," she said when she thought I wasn't looking, "your hands look like my mother's when she was painting the kitchen yellow." The sentence came and sat down beside me carefully, like a memory that knows how to behave in company. I touched the edges of the folder and felt James lean in from his framed August. "If someone insists on a battle, call Martin and the sheriff, not your son." I had followed instructions. It startled me to realize how much relief there is in obedience, when obedience is finally given to a good plan. The car announced itself with gravel spit and a song on the radio that seemed too certain of its chorus. Garrett got out first, Marissa behind him in a dress that asked the trees to agree they were too messy. A white SUV followed, and for a breath I thought it was a neighbor, until two men stepped out with a large camera and a bag of lenses like surgical instruments. Marissa waved at them and then at me. "Content," she said with a brightness that broke without warning, "helps listings go viral." Deputy Lane took one step forward and the men stopped where the lawn became the porch. and where apparently my patience would not be shared. No filming on private property without the owner's consent, the deputy said. She didn't say I didn't consent. She didn't have to. The word owner made a sound in my ear like a bell finding its note. We sat. The sky found its gray. The first cool pinpricks of a coming storm pricked my forearms the way truth pricks a lie before it punctures it. Garrett began with the speech he'd been practicing in his car, vowels rounded for sincerity. Mom, this got out of hand. I looked at his hands empty, immaculate, impatient. It did. I said because you kept handing it out. Marissa crossed one elegant leg over the other and leaned forward like a cobra pretending to check the temperature of the room. Before we let this spin, she said, let's remember who is the older person here. Memory gets selective. I slid the printed bank record across the table with the gentleness you reserve for a baby you plan to raise differently. The investigator traced authorizations to your home network on these dates. Recordings show a woman insisting on an override of voice verification. The bank will happily confirm to you, deputy. The deputy nodded, already knowing. Marissa smiled, a thing with too many teeth. A network is not a person, she said. Lots of people could have. She stopped because Rebecca, who had been quiet like water listening to a shore, reached into her tote and pulled out a single printed email with a highlight like a small sunrise. I printed this when I was asked to print a listing deck, she said, her voice steady, barely shaking at its edges. It's an email from your phone, Marissa, to Dad, with the subject, Edith's card details for auto payments, and a signature block that is just your initial. You attached a photo of her card front and back. Dates match the first charges. She swallowed. I took this to Martin. He said to let the adults handle it. I'm letting you. She put the paper down and then, as if she had to steady something inside herself, placed her hand on top of mine. In the pause that followed, the lake performed a small miracle of timing. A wind moved across it so evenly, you could see the line between yesterday and today travel from left to right. A loon, offended by the commotion, dove and stayed under longer than decent conversation would allow. Garrett's face went through a series of small collapses until it found a shape he could tolerate. You went through my... he began, but his sentence didn't know where to live, now that the house of pretend had been condemned. He looked at Marissa, not to ask for truth, but to borrow a version that would cost him less. She didn't look back. Her sunglasses, which had been too proud of their reflections, began to collect the beginning of rain. The deputy cleared her throat without impatience. Mr. Pierce. Ms. Pierce, you're aware we can move this into a criminal matter, she said, voice all velvet and scaffolding. Ms. Pierce, she nodded to me, has the right to ask for charges. There are also civil paths we've discussed. She didn't say that the choice was mine, but she looked at me the way a person looks at a hand on a switch. I heard it then, the missing piece, the long-buried thing that had been tapping at the floorboards like a trapped moth. It came not as thunder, but as a sentence that had been waiting for a mouth. That first text, I said, and my voice was quiet, because big truths do not need to shout, the one that said, you weren't invited, my wife doesn't want you there. Who sent it? Garrett blinked, his pupils widening as if the world had dimmed. I mean, it came from my phone. Who typed it? I asked. He looked down, which is the direction of shame when it is telling the truth. Marissa, he said, and the way he said her name sounded for the first time, like the word that it was not the charm that had been strung on it. She said it was better coming from me. The porch was very still. Even the birdhouse paused in its pointless sway, as if you could ask a nail to hold its breath. Marissa rolled her eyes, that adolescent motion performed by a woman who had never forgiven life for not taking her side as a default. We were protecting our peace, she said, and I felt something in me reach for a chair and sit down so it could laugh without falling. Your peace, I said, and it felt like the smallest, sharpest chisel. It's built on other people's noise. There are climaxes that are firework shows, gasp, crackle, applause, and there are the quieter ones that happen like a series of clicks as a lock learns how to love the right key. The deputy radioed the bank investigator. A voice came through confirming an incident report and an offer to send along the call recordings. Martin, who had placed his number on the deputy's phone earlier, answered on the first ring. Paper moved across the table and into the deputy's hands, from the deputy back to me, from me to Garrett, who held it the way a man holds a newborn he can't pretend isn't his. The rain started in earnest, thick drops that made coins on the deck. Marissa tucked her hair behind her ear and studied the lake as if it had betrayed her by having a horizon she couldn't reposition. "I won't take you to jail today," I said, and my voice betrayed nothing theatrical except its steadiness. "But I will not save you from the truth, Garrett. Not anymore." He looked at me like a boy whose pockets have been turned inside out. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and the sentence was so new on his tongue that it cut him a little on its way out. "Return what isn't yours," I said, naming the first obvious thing. "Apologize to the granddaughter who had to become the adult. Sit with a counselor who will teach you to grow a spine where I've been your stand-in. And stay away until you can knock." He nodded, and then didn't, a man trying on a gesture and realizing it doesn't fit yet. Rebecca, braver than anyone had taught her to be, lifted her chin and said, "Dad, I'll come if you go." He looked at her then, with a grief that nearly undid me. Because grief, even when we deserve it, is still grief, and I am still a mother who recognizes her child's hurt, as if it were a scar stitched into her own skin. Marissa stood scattering rain. "This is absurd," she said, turning to the cameramen who had stayed respectfully useless. "We're leaving." Garrett. He did not move. If transformations make a sound, it is the silence of a man who has just realized no one is going to carry him out of his own mess. He sat. The storm slid sideways, a curtain opening, the birdhouse loose on its nail, wrenched, tilted, and then fell. I reached out without thinking and caught it against my chest. Ugly thing. Faithful thing. My hands cradled it like an infant that didn't ask to be made and still needed saving. I laughed, one sharp, astonished breath that broke into a softer sound. Rebecca started laughing too, the kind that dissolves everything hard in the room for a moment, so Mercy can walk around and get a good look at where to sit. We made no grand pronouncements. The deputy took statements with the seriousness that turns chaos into paper and paper into boundary. Garrett agreed to sign what needed signing. Marissa got in the car and slammed the door so hard that the loons scolded her. The cameramen withdrew like embarrassed thoughts. When it was over, the deputy stood and asked me gently and squarely the question that would carry us into the last stretch of this long road. "Ms. Pierce," she said, rain shining on the brim of her hat, "do you want to press charges?" The lake held its breath. Rebecca's fingers closed around mine. Somewhere in a world where August is a forever, James looked at me the way he used to when I was about to do something he'd be proud of. I took a breath that felt like a clean room and opened my mouth. I looked at Deputy Lane, at Rebecca's brave hand wrapped around mine, at the storm writing dots across the deck. A woman can spend a lifetime measuring herself against mercy and still at the end discover that mercy without truth becomes a disguise for fear. I thought of James's letters, of the line written in his square, earnest print, "Call Martin and the sheriff, not your son." He hadn't asked me to be cruel. He'd asked me to be clear. "Yes," I said. The word felt like a key finding its shape. "I want the report to stand. I want the recordings preserved. I want the bank's file attached. And when you speak to the prosecutor, please say that I'm open to a restorative path for my son if he returns what he took and does the work of becoming a man. For his wife, proceed as the facts require." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look for anyone's approval. Clarity can be soft and still be steel. The deputy nodded once, not like a gavel, but like someone setting a dish where it belongs. Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a word, the throat's animal making an attempt before language can. He covered his mouth with his hand, a boy again, but this time there was no one nearby to translate his fear into permissions. Rebecca's grip grew firmer. "Thank you," she whispered, and I couldn't tell if she was speaking to me or to the future. Rain thickened in a polite way, as if the sky had finally decided to take a position. Marissa had already sealed herself inside the SUV, brightness gone. The cameramen, absolved by the deputy's stare, left without the footage that would have let them make strangers' outrage into a product. Garrett remained a man on a porch where the rules had been announced, and none of them included a shortcut. Deputy Lane finished her notes and rose. "We'll follow up next week," she said, tucking her pen away like a small sword she didn't need to brandish to be believed. After they drove off, the lake exhaled. Rebecca and I sat without talking. There is a yes that ripples out from your mouth and changes the furniture of a place. The porch settled around it. I set the ugly blue birdhouse on my lap and let my thumbs find the ridges of its paint, chipped and loyal. I remembered the day we'd hung it, a neighbor gift we had mocked in private and honored in practice. James had hammered the nail with that careful too-loudness of a man dealing with something delicate. Traditions, he had said, are what we love enough to repeat. I had repeated too many things I did not love. We ate sandwiches with the plain appetite of people who have done a hard thing and must now remember to feed themselves like the living. When the rain slowed to a fine curtain, Rebecca stood, took the hammer from the porch hook and offered it to me. "Your house," she said simply. I rose and found a sturdier beam. The first tap was tentative, the second more certain, the third, the light insistence of a woman who has learned that she does not have to announce her strength for it to work. The nail held. The birdhouse swung back into its silly, steadfast place. We both laughed, the kind of laughter that stitches something closed without leaving a scar. The days that followed were a choreography of paper and quiet. Martin called to say the bank's internal report matched Deputy Lane's. "The recordings are decisive," he said gently. We filed the civil agreements. A restitution plan notarized and unambiguous, an affidavit revoking permissions that should never have existed, a letter to the district attorney asking for a restorative recommendation for Garrett therapy repayment, a course on financial ethics that would make him sit week after week in a chair where he could not explain himself into absolution. For Marissa, a separate path. The call recordings had her voice as cleanly as rain has a smell. I did not rejoice. I slept better. There was, of course, the storm you can't dock it. My voicemail filled with the choreography of panic-long messages from Garrett that circled and pleaded and refused to land. Short ones from friends of Marissa's who mistook theater for truth. A trembling call from my cousin Celia offering to pray, and I took it because prayer is the kind of help that asks nothing in return. In the evenings, I let Rebecca read me the transcripts aloud. She has a calm voice, a librarian's gift for turning chaos into story. We stopped when it hurt. We started again. Somewhere in those nights, I realized that this was repentance, not the grand apology shouted across a porch, but the slow work of holding your face to the consequences without flinching. Garrett signed the plan. He used the pen like it might burn him. He met with a counselor whose office smelled like eucalyptus and old carpet. He began awkwardly to do the inventory of a life built on someone else's open hand. The first payments arrived in small, embarrassed amounts, the math of a man learning to live within his own earnings. Marissa hired a lawyer who wrote letters shaped like threats that collapsed when Martin breathed on them. The bank sent formal apologies with corporate words for "we should have known better." The DA filed charges against Marissa for fraud and unauthorized access. Her lawyer asked for a plea. The cameramen posted a video about ethics in content creation and turned off comments. The internet found something else to chant about. I watered my roses. If this were a movie, perhaps the cabin would have hosted a final fireworks scene where everyone reconciled under a sky scripted to agree. Life is stranger and more honest. Rebecca and I drove up most weekends. We painted the porch rail the color of clean milk and let the paint dry on our wrists in patient moons. We repaired the screen where the squirrels had lobbied their case. We found the old quilts and aired them until they remembered their softness. Once while sweeping, I found a bobby pin in the floorboards that must have belonged to me at 38. And the memory flooded a night dancing clumsily with James to a radio playing 3 songs behind the station. We wanted the two of us laughing, because being offbeat together still counts as dancing. I held the pin a long time before placing it in a jar labeled "Past Lives," which did not exist until that moment, and once named, felt necessary. On a Sunday that baked the dock into a low hymn, Garrett drove up alone. He stood at the edge of the yard like a man asking if the ground would accept him. I watched from the porch and did not rise until he lifted his hand. He didn't walk onto the boards until I nodded. In his face, there was a newness I didn't recognize, something like humility, but too tender to carry a name yet. He sat on the step below mine like a boy who knows how to honor levels. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was not one of those apologies with an aside. "I am sorry I made you mother my laziness. I am sorry I let someone else use your love like a credit line. I am sorry I forgot you were not a utility, but a person." He swallowed, and I watched the old argument in his throat lose interest in pleading his case. "If you never forgive me, I will still pay you back. I need you to know that. Forgiveness is not a switch. Sometimes it is a porch built plank by plank. I will not forget, and I will not pretend nothing happened," I said. "But I won't devote the rest of my life to hating you either. You don't deserve that much rent in me." His laugh was short and wet. He nodded. "May I sit here sometimes?" "On the step when you've called first," I said, and handed him a paintbrush. We spent the afternoon side by side silent, except when the wind asked a question we could answer together, and at dusk, he left without asking for a key. Progress often looks like what is not requested. News came brisk and unsentimental. Marissa took a plea that kept her out of jail and into fines community service, and a ban from managing anyone else's finances for 5 years. She posted sunshine on the internet. I did not look. Boundaries are partly where you keep your eyes. She called once from an unfamiliar number, the thin bravado in her hello, the only familiar thing between us. "You ruined our lives," she said. "No," I answered, and my voice had become the lake in October, clear, cold, unwilling to lie. "I quit letting you ruin mine." Rebecca finished her year of school with a poem that made her teacher cry, a piece about women who return grocery carts in the rain, how civilization is saved by small returns. She read it to me on the porch while the ugly birdhouse listened, as if it had been waiting to be included in literature. We celebrated with lavender pie from the diner that still refuses to be embarrassed by its personality. We told the truth about our family, as if it were a country we loved enough to map, noting the borders and the places where the land gives way to water, and where boats must be used instead of feet. I think of the first night, the blue bloom of the phone, the sentence that cut. I think of the slow climb toward a different kind of loved one with a spine and good shoes. I think of the moment on the porch when the deputy asked me a question, and I answered not just for that day but for every day that had failed to hear me. I think of James, who tried to make a path for me through a bramble he knew would grow, whether or not he came back with the shears. And I think of the women who will hear this and recognize their own kitchen, their own folder of papers, their own habit of saying, "It's fine to a storm." Here is what I know now at 77, with lemon zest under my nails and the cabin key warm in my pocket. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries. Love given without measure and without memory becomes a myth of yourself that other people are happy to worship until the altar asks them to bring wood. Mercy is holy when it refuses to participate in its own abuse. Tradition is only beautiful when it remembers to be kind. And family is not a password, it is a practice, repeated, tested, repaired, kept. If you are listening, and you feel that familiar quiet breaking in your chest, if you have been someone's safety net so long you forgot, you can also be a person who walks on the ground. Let this be the permission you didn't know you were waiting for. Return the cart in the rain because you are decent. Lock the door because you are worthy. Pour the tea you intend to drink. And if you must choose between being loved for disappearing or being alone for staying visible, let your own company be the place that finally tells the truth. If this story found you at the right moment, stay with me. Like this video, if it put language to something you've lived, share it with someone who needs a soft-spoken courage. Subscribe if you want more honest rooms you can sit in. And tell me in the comments the boundary you learned to keep, the one that saved you. I'm listening.